The machine did not know the difference between a steel rod and a man's hand, neither did the rollers, and by 1900, steelworkers in Pittsburgh had a name for what happened when someone got too close. They called it getting rolled. The rollers did not stop when that happened. They did not slow down. The mill kept running because the mill always kept running, and the men who understood that fact were the ones who made it home. But sometimes understanding was not enough. If you are watching Steel and Sweat for the first time, this is what we do here. We find the forgotten machines and the men who ran them, and we tell you what they actually did and what it actually cost. Subscribe and drop a comment with the industrial story you want us to dig into next. The rolling mill sat at the end of the steel-making process. Everything that came before it, the blast furnace charging iron ore and coke and limestone into pig iron, the Bessemer converter blowing air through that iron to make steel, the open hearth furnace refining it over 8 or 12 hours, all of that was preparation. The rolling mill was the machine that turned steel into a product someone could use, rails for railroads, wire for telegraph lines, plate for ship hulls and boiler casings, structural shapes for buildings. If you wanted steel in a usable form in 1890, it came through a rolling mill, and the rolling mill was where the steelman's profession became, in a direct mechanical sense, the most dangerous room in an already dangerous industry. The principle of a rolling mill is simple enough. You take a piece of metal while it is still hot, still soft from the furnace, and you pass it through 2 steel cylinders rotating toward each other. The gap between those cylinders is set to be smaller than the metal coming in. The metal deforms under the pressure and comes out flatter, thinner, longer on the other side. If you do this repeatedly, rotating the cylinders closer together each time, you can reduce a thick billet of steel into a thin rod or a sheet or a rail or a wire of precise dimension. That is the whole process. You can explain it in 2 sentences. But the machine that performed that process weighed thousands of tons, ran on steam engines generating thousands of horsepower, and spun its rollers at speeds that made the gap between them not a space where adjustments were made, but a point of no return. When 2 steel cylinders, each one 3 feet in diameter and spinning at a surface speed of 40, 50, or 60 miles per hour, converge at a gap of 1/4 inch, the pulling force at that nigh P point is not something a human being resists. The metal goes in and the metal comes out. Whatever goes in comes out. The rolling mill did not distinguish between steel and the hand of the man guiding the steel. It had no mechanism to make that distinction. The physics of the nip point applied to everything that entered it, and it applied instantaneously. The building that housed a major rolling mill at a plant like Homestead or Carnegie's Edgar Thomson Works was built around that mechanical reality. A large rod mill or rail mill occupied a building 1,000 feet long or more with a series of roll stands positioned along a central floor line, each stand set to a progressively smaller gap, the steel traveling from one to the next, growing longer and thinner and faster with each pass. The furnaces were at one end, heating the steel billets to the rolling temperature of somewhere between 1,800 and 2,200 degrees Fahrenheit, the color going from black to red to orange to yellow as the heat went up. The steel came out of the furnace on a roller table moving toward the first roll stand. When it entered the first pair of rolls, the steel was about as thick as a man's forearm. When it left the last stand, it might be the diameter of a pencil, and it had been moving at 60 miles per hour to get there. That progression of speed was not incidental. The steel elongated as it passed through each set of rollers, and as it elongated, it moved faster, the way a river moves faster where the channel narrows. The workers at the end of a rod mill were working with steel, moving at speeds no horse could outrun, steel that was still glowing red from the heat of its own friction and the accumulated heat of the furnace it came from. And those workers were not standing behind barriers. There were no barriers. They were standing at the exit of the last roll stand with tongs, catching the steel as it emerged and controlling where it went. The men who did that work were called catchers, and the boys who did a version of it were called loopers, or looper boys. The looper's job existed because a rolling mill processed steel through multiple passes in sequence, and after each pass, the steel had to be redirected back into the next roll stand. In the early mills, before any mechanical guidance was engineered into the process, this was done by hand. A looper, often a young man in his teens or early 20s, sometimes younger, positioned himself beside the exit of one roll stand. When the steel came through, hot and fast, he caught it with a hooked rod and looped it over and back into the entry of the next stand. He did this continuously, across a 12-hour shift, with steel that could be anywhere from bright orange to dark red, depending on where in the rolling sequence it was. If his hook caught a bad angle and the steel kicked sideways, it went wherever physics directed it. If he moved too slowly, redirecting the loop, the steel piled up between stands and tangled, which was called a cobble, and a cobble at speed sent hot steel in multiple directions at once. The hierarchy in a rolling mill crew had structure to it, the same way every crew in a steel mill had structure. At the top was the roller, the skilled man who set the gap between the rolls and was responsible for the quality of the finished product. Below him was the rougher, who operated the initial passes and managed the heavier work at the furnace end of the sequence. Below the rougher were the catchers, who handled the finished steel coming off the last stand. Below the catchers were the loopers, who redirected the steel between passes. And below everyone else in the hierarchy, though not in greater physical risk, was the heater, the man who ran the furnace and controlled the temperature of the billets going into the mill. He was the one whose judgment about when a billet was ready to roll shaped everything that happened downstream. The cobble was the rolling mill's second major hazard, distinct from the nip point and in some ways harder to protect against because it was unpredictable in direction. A cobble happened when the steel failed to pass cleanly through a set of rollers, most often because a billet had an internal crack, or an uneven temperature from the furnace, or because the looper's redirect sent the steel into the next stand at an angle that the rolls could not accept. When that happened, the steel buckled and whipped. A piece of rod steel moving at 40 miles per hour that suddenly lost its path through the rolls had to go somewhere, and where it went was determined by geometry and speed and the position of the men standing near it. Cobbles wrapped themselves around roll stands and machinery in seconds, creating tangled masses of hot steel that the men called birds' nests. Clearing a cobble was its own category of dangerous work, requiring men to approach entangled red-hot steel with bars and hooks and manually free the machinery. But cobbles were not simply equipment failures, they were also injury mechanisms. A rod steel cobble in a fast rod mill could reach a man standing 20 feet from the roll stand in less than a second. The men who worked those mills developed a specific spatial awareness about where to stand relative to the roll line, a constant orientation to exit paths that was not instilled by any formal training, but by watching what happened when someone's attention drifted. The mill floor taught its own curriculum, and the cost of a lesson in cobble avoidance was high enough that most men absorbed the principle without needing the lesson directly. The roller was the craftsman of this operation, a position that took years of accumulated knowledge to perform and that paid wages reflecting that scarcity. He read the steel as it came through his rolls by watching its color and the way it deformed, and he made adjustments to the gap and the speed based on what he saw. Rolling steel to consistent dimension required that kind of judgment, and the man who had it was worth what the mill paid him. But the roller stood at a remove from the most dangerous part of the process. He controlled the machine. He did not physically interact with the steel between passes the way the looper did. The looper was the one with his hands nearest to the nip point, and the looper was the one the injury statistics reflected. John Fitch's 1910 study of Pittsburgh steelworkers, the most thorough documentation of industrial conditions in that era, noted rolling mill operations as a consistent source of crushing injuries and burns. The classification is precise enough to understand what was being described. A crushing injury in a rolling mill context meant contact with a nip point. The rollers, generating thousands of pounds of pulling force at the point of convergence, did not stop at the surface of what they grabbed. They processed it the way they processed steel. What the industry called getting rolled was understood in the mills as an outcome that was possible and had happened and would happen again, a recognized category of workplace event rather than an unforeseeable emergency. Carnegie Steel's annual report for 1892 listed 22 deaths and 195 serious injuries across its rolling operations for that year, and described the numbers without obvious alarm. The mills ran continuously. The injury rates were part of the operating calculus. A rolling mill that produced 300 tons of finished steel per shift and lost 2 men per month was, in the language of the 1890s industrial accounting, productive. The men who worked those mills understood this math even if they did not have access to the reports that contained it. They understood it the way the men around them understood it, through the evidence of their own eyes and the stories passed between shifts. If you're finding this history as gripping as I do, go ahead and hit subscribe right now and let me know in the comments which industrial machine you want covered next. The thing about the NIP point that made it uniquely lethal compared to most other industrial hazards was its speed and its indiscrimination. A boiler explosion killed through pressure and heat and gave no warning, but it was at least a different physical mechanism than the work itself. A molten steel breakout was catastrophic, but required a specific failure of equipment. The rolling mill's danger was continuous and structural. The most dangerous element of the machine was the same element that performed the work. The nip point was not a failure state. It was the operating state. The rollers worked by pulling things through, and they pulled indiscriminately. Workers wore leather aprons and leather gloves in the worst of the heat exposure, but the protective equipment of the rolling mill era addressed burns far more than it addressed mechanical injury. Leather aprons did not stop a man from being pulled into a set of rollers if his glove caught the edge of the steel passing through. The tongs the catchers and loopers used were the primary interface between the worker and the steel, and those tongs were held by human hands that were necessarily close to the steel they were guiding. The design of the tongs improved over decades with longer handles and better grip geometry, but the fundamental problem of proximity could not be engineered away completely as long as men were doing the caching and looping by hand. The wages paid to rolling mill workers reflected the hierarchy of risk with some accuracy, but not perfect precision. The roller, the man at the top of the crew, earned wages that put him in the upper tier of steel mill labor, sometimes $5 to $7 a day at a time, when common labor in the same mill earned $1 or $1.50. The rougher earned somewhat less. The catcher and looper earned less still, though their physical exposure to injury was higher than anyone except perhaps the roller himself when the mill was running at full speed. The looper boy, if he was actually a boy in the sense of being under 16, earned wages that were sometimes half what the adult catchers made, and those wages were paid for work that put him physically closest to the steel between passes. The steel industry's compensation structure for injuries in this period operated, when it operated at all, through a combination of negligence law and company discretion. A man who lost a hand to a rolling mill nip point had legal recourse only if he could demonstrate that the mill operator had been negligent, and the industry's standard legal defense was the doctrine of assumed risk. A man who took a job in a rolling mill understood the risks of the work and had effectively agreed to accept them by showing up. Courts supported this position more often than not through the 1890s and into the 1900s. The practical outcome was that a looper boy who lost fingers to a cobble at age 16 might receive a settlement negotiated by his father with the company's claims agent, a figure often in the range of a few $100s, or he might receive nothing at all. The Pennsylvania Workmen's Compensation Act of 1915 changed this framework significantly, establishing a no-fault compensation system that paid injured workers without requiring proof of employer negligence. But 1915 was decades into the operating life of those mills, and the men who had been through the roll stands before that year had no such protection. The wire mill was a specific subset of rolling mill operations that deserves its own paragraph, because the steel it produced and the speed at which it was produced created a unique set of conditions for the men working it. Wire was made by drawing rod steel, which itself came from rolling, through progressively smaller dies until it reached wire gauge. The rod mills that fed wire drawing were among the fastest mills in the steel industry because the product was small in diameter and required many passes to reach finished size. That meant the machinery ran at the highest speeds the process required. A rod mill making wire rod in Pittsburgh in 1900 was moving steel at 50 or 60 miles per hour through the final stands, faster than any other common rolling operation. The men catching and looping that rod were working at the limit of human reaction time, and the wire mills accumulated the accident statistics to confirm it. But the wire mills also produced one of the most valuable finished products in the steel industry, because wire went into everything from fence and telegraph lines to suspension bridge cable, and the demand was continuous. The mills ran until the wire was done, and the men ran with the mills. But the mills were not static. The technology that reduced the physical danger to workers also reduced the number of workers the mill required, and the two outcomes were inseparable. The continuous hot strip mill, first operational at Carnegie Steel in Butler, Pennsylvania in 1923, eliminated the looping step by running the steel through a fully continuous sequence of roll stands without requiring redirection between passes. The steel entered one end and came out the other, without anyone needing to catch and loop it between stands. The men who had been looper boys found their positions mechanized, and the rolling mill crew sizes contracted. Carnegie's Homestead plant had run rod mill crews of 40 or more men in peak periods around 1900. By the 1930s, continuous strip mill operations were running comparable tonnage with crews a fraction of that size. The survivors of that reduction were the men with specialized skills, the rollers and the setup men, whose knowledge of the machine's behavior remained worth something, even as the machine became more automated. The men without specialized skills found that the same process that had made their work dangerous had also made it replaceable, and that the industry's interest in reducing injuries and the industry's interest in reducing labor costs pointed in the same direction. The production scale those mills achieved, even with the continuous human cost, is worth stating plainly. By 1900, Homestead's rail mill was processing more than 300 tons of finished steel per 12-hour shift. Edgar Thomson, Carnegie's primary rail mill, was producing half the structural steel going into American railroad infrastructure during peak periods. The steel that built the bridges across the Ohio, the Mississippi, and the Susquehanna, the steel that went into the elevated railway structures in Chicago and New York, the structural beams in the early skyscrapers of lower Manhattan came from plants that operated on those fatality rates and that treated them as an acceptable cost of production. Could you imagine walking into a building like that for the first shift of a Monday morning, knowing that the man who stood at your position the previous Friday had not finished the shift? The men who did it were not reckless. They were skilled, careful, and experienced. They had learned the mill the way you learn any dangerous environment, through attention and repetition and the slow accumulation of the knowledge of where the margins were. But the margins in a rolling mill, specifically at the NIP point, were thin enough that they occasionally disappeared, and the mill had no mechanism to compensate for that disappearance. The rolling mill accident statistics in Fitch's study, and in the Pennsylvania Bureau of Industrial Statistics, reports from the same era show that experienced workers, men with years on the job, were not significantly safer than newer workers in the rolling department specifically. The reason was mechanical rather than skill-related. An experienced looper was faster and more accurate than a new one, and that experience mattered at the margins. But the nip point did not give extra clearance to experienced men. The roller went at the same speed regardless of who was guiding the steel toward it. The skill gap between a new looper and an experienced one compressed under those conditions. By the 1940s, the hand-operated rod mill was becoming rare in American steel. The war years accelerated the push toward mechanized continuous mills because the demand for steel plate, structural shapes, and rod exceeded what hand-rolling crews could produce even at 12-hour shifts 6 days a week. The mills that remained hand-operated were in older plants serving specialty markets, where continuous mill capital investment was not justified by the production volume. The last hand-operated rod mill in the United States closed in the 1960s. The men who had run it either retired or moved to other mill work. But what those mills produced across their operating lifespan, from the 1870s through the mid-20th century was not just steel. They produced the material basis of a country's physical infrastructure during the period when that infrastructure was being built. The rails and the wire and the plate and the structural shapes that came out of those rolling mills went into things that are still in use. There are bridges in Pennsylvania and Ohio and Illinois carrying traffic today over water that was first spanned by steel that came from a rolling mill with a crew of 40 men working at a pace that killed some of them. The bridge does not carry the history of how its steel was made. The steel does not mark where it came from or what it cost. The men who ran those mills are in the accident reports and the labor studies and the company records, if you know where to look. They are in the Pennsylvania Bureau of Industrial Statistics reports from the 1880s and 1890s listed by category of injury rather than by name in most cases. They are in Fitch's study documented as a pattern rather than as individuals. They are in the foreman's logbooks that survive in archive collections noted as absent or transferred, or in the column that appears with regular frequency, permanently separated from employment. The mill kept running when a man got hurt, and it kept running when a man died. That was not cruelty in the minds of the men who managed those operations. That was the nature of continuous production, and the men inside understood it as clearly as the men in the offices did. The machine did not know the difference. The men did. They went in anyway, every shift, for the wages and the work and the specific pride of knowing how to operate in an environment that most people would not have lasted an hour in. That is not nothing. It is, in fact, the thing that built the country they lived in, from the inside of a building full of machines that would have killed any of them given half a chance. They gave the machines less than half a chance most of the time. And when they did not, the mill kept running, and the next shift came in.